Please pray with me. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts always be acceptable to you, our strength, our rock, and our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
Please be seated. As he began his sermon a couple of weeks ago, Adam made mention that during this season of Epiphany, we seem to be blessed by a real sermon series, which is not typical of our experience here at St. Michael's, having 6 different preachers rotating through the church year. The scripture readings for this season have certainly made it rather easy to connect sermon to sermon, because Epiphany is all about revelation or manifestation. In our case, the manifestation of who Jesus is and the revelation of what that might mean in our lives. So let's review where we've been. You'll recall that Epiphany, which falls on the 6th of January each year, is the day we celebrate the coming of the wise men from the East, bringing royal gifts to Jesus and his parents, manifesting Jesus' kingly identity. On the Sunday following the Feast of Epiphany, we began this apparent sermon series with a look at Jesus' baptism by John, when a voice from heaven proclaims that Jesus is God's Son, the Beloved, in whom God is well pleased. And we learned that our baptism, much like Jesus's, is not our graduation or the end of our story, but truly the beginning of our ministry in the world. The next Sunday, we heard from Diana that our baptism equips us with the gifts we need to perform the ministry to which we each are called, and that we discern this calling together in community. After that, Adam shared with us that we are called to repent, to recognize the things in our lives that are out of sync with what we are called to in our baptism, and to change them. Then last week, it may have seemed that we took a week off from Epiphany because we were back to looking at Jesus as a baby in the presentation of Jesus at the temple. But there was an Epiphany moment when Simeon recognized Jesus as the promised salvation for both the people of Israel and the Gentiles. Diana reminded us that just as Mary and Joseph carried the baby Jesus into the temple, we carried the light of Christ into our worship, and then again out into the world at the end of our service. And she challenged us to recognize the light of Christ around us as we go through our day, to look for those Epiphany moments when Christ is revealed to us in our worship, in the world, and in our own lives. So here we are today. Had we not celebrated the feast of the presentation of Jesus in the temple last week, our gospel reading then would have been the preceding verses from today's passage in Matthew, which would have set the stage for where we begin today. Those verses begin, "When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them." Thus begins what we know as the Sermon on the Mount. Diana reminded us last week that the beginning of this teaching is called the Beatitudes, all those verses that begin, "Blessed are." We know that the disciples were part of Jesus' audience, but scholars also believe that the crowds followed Jesus up the hillside, because when Jesus finally finishes his teaching, which we'll read a few weeks from now, it reads, "And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who has authority." Likely, this crowd of listeners was a diverse group of interested people: Jews, Gentiles, foreigners, maybe even Roman citizens. The good news that Jesus is proclaiming is for everyone, no matter their status, their station in life, or their ethnicity. Just like the Beatitudes, our passage today is probably familiar to all of you. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. What could it possibly mean that we are the salt of the earth? I think to answer that, we need to know a little something about salt. Salt adds flavor. Adding salt to an otherwise dull and tasteless food can make it come alive and delicious. Salt can also serve as a preservative, allowing food to stay fresh much longer. For example, you may have heard of salted fish like cod, or salt-cured meat like bacon. And who among us doesn't love bacon? Salt also creates thirst. After eating a bowl of well-salted popcorn, I bet we all want a tall glass of water to quench that thirst. Each of these qualities of salt have significance for us in our lives as Christians. Jesus is calling us to create the rich flavor that brings joy to our lives as well as the lives of those around us. Jesus is asking us to be the preservative that keeps the good news of the gospel visible to others. And Jesus is asking us to let our saltiness create a thirst for God in our families, our neighborhoods, and our world. If we have let our saltiness go, Jesus says, we're no longer good for anything. I sure don't want to hear him say that about me. But it's not just about salt. Jesus also teaches you are the light of the world. Light has no value if it's hidden away. I think that Jesus is telling us that it is up to us to bring the light of Christ into a dark and broken world. Professor of theology Charles Cook shared, in order for light to be seen, we must be willing to go where the darkness exists, to engage and walk through it so that in time the light can overcome it. Poet and author Annie Dillard also wrote, "You do not have to sit outside in the dark. If, however, you want to look at the stars, you will find that darkness is necessary." And one of our offertory sentences in the Book of Common Prayer calls us to let our light shine before others that they may see the good works we do and glorify your Father in heaven. All this sounds wonderful. These are great images, but they don't tell us how to do it, how to be salt and light. So I have a few suggestions. First, we have to remember what Diana taught us last week. The light that we are called to spread around us is not originally our light. It is the light of Christ. It is the light that comes from us allowing the Spirit of God to work in our lives. How does the Spirit do this work, you might wonder? In our reading from 1 Corinthians this morning, Paul declares, "When I came to you, brothers and sisters, I did not come proclaiming the mystery of God to you in lofty words or wisdom. For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I came to you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. My speech and my proclamation were not with plausible words of wisdom, but with a demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith may not rest on human wisdom, but on the power of God." Just like for Paul, the Spirit can work through us when we get out of the way, when we recognize our own weakness and ask for God's power to do the work. This requires attention, doesn't it? This kind of attention comes through regular prayer, reminding us of our dependence on God. It comes through the study of the Scriptures, so that we can recognize the mind of Christ speaking and working through us. It also comes from sharing in a strong Christian community that discerns with us and calls us to account in love when we have strayed. We can also learn how to be salt and light through our Old Testament reading this morning, where we get another glimpse of the mind of God. This is one of my favorite passages in Isaiah. The whole book of Isaiah the prophet was written as a teaching about the Israelites' exile to Babylon and their return to their own homeland. This morning's verses in particular provide a lesson on just how they are to rebuild their land. Despite their joyful celebration at their release from captivity, God has some very tough words for them. If they are going to be salt and light again to the nations around them, they have to give up doing things their ways and listen for God's way. God speaks through Isaiah. "Announce to my people their rebellion, to the house of Jacob their sins. Yet day after day they seek me and delight to know my ways, as if they were a nation that practiced righteousness and did not forsake the ordinance of their God. They ask of me righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to God. Why do we fast, but you do not see? Why humble ourselves, but you do not notice? Look, you serve your own interest on your fast day and oppress all your workers. Look, you fast only to quarrel and fight, and to strike with a wicked fist. Such fasting as you do today will not make your voice heard on high. Is such the fast that I choose? A day to humble oneself? Is it to bow down the head like a bulrush and to lie in sackcloth and ashes? Will you call this a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? If God's people are to live righteous lives, pleasing God, they must begin to change their ways and live by God's words. It's not that fasting is wrong. It's that the Israelites are trying to do it their way. They think that they're doing everything right while lying around in sackcloth and ashes. But did they ask what God wanted from them? They may look humble on the outside, but God knows that sacrifice is not enough. Isaiah continues his prophecy from God. Is not this the fast I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them and not to hide yourself from your own kin? Sacrifice is good, of course, but without changing one's actions and behavior towards others, it serves no purpose and is rejected. Only by living and acting for justice and compassion for all people can the Israelites please God. God makes it clear that to be light for those around them, they have to change their ways. The prophecy affirms that if you do these things, then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. If you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom be like the noonday. Just as for the Israelites, if we are to let Christ's light shine through us, we can't be merely doing things our way. We can't let our piety and humility be just for show. We have to live it by giving our whole lives to God. That will mean for us, too, that we must work to put an end to injustice. We must reach out to those who live in poverty, those who are homeless and hungry. Our lives must be more than mere words. Our lives must be lives of action for others. When we do this, the light of Christ will shine brightly through us, and people will want to know our God. Our lives will become an epiphany moment for others. Living as salt and light is not easy. But the good news is that we have a God who delights to walk with us and teach us as we go. And we have a community of people right here at St. Michael's who love us and are willing to walk this journey of saltiness and light with us so that we can go out into our neighborhoods and spread the light of Christ with others. Jesus didn't say, you will be the salt of the earth, or you will be the light of the world. He said, you are. We already have the ability. We are empowered by the Spirit of God. May we be eager to follow Jesus' teaching, recognizing his work in us, and go out and bring this salt and light to others. May it be so. Amen.
Amen.